All right. It is that special time again, time for food safety enthusiasts to come together in what we affectionately call FSMA Friday. So, welcome everybody. My name is Jim Albright, and today we are going to learn about some of the areas where hazard analysis and food safety plans might be vulnerable, and what pillars that you may need to fortify in order to build up a stronger food safety culture at your facility. But before we begin, hazard analysis is such a hot topic, and we have a record-breaking number of folks who had registered for today's event. So for all you newcomers, we're very glad you're here. FSMA Friday is a monthly series for all of us within the food supply chain to get regular updates, insights, and guidance around the changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, this session is brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group, and is your chance to not only learn about methodologies and tools that'll help you consistently meet FSMA requirements, but this is your forum to get your food safety questions answered. Now, we've muted all attendee mics, but we are leaving room at the end for some Q&A. So please do add your comments and questions at any time during today's presentation, and we'll do our best to get through them all. But if we happen to run out of some time, we will absolutely get back to you after the session. Do not worry. And yes, we are recording this presentation, so please do keep a lookout in your inbox later today. We'll be sending the recording along with the presentation slides. All right. I am very excited to have with us Sam Davidson, who has over 30 years experience in FSQA roles before joining the Acheson Group as the Director of Food Safety. Sam, it's great to have you with us. And I know we are anxious to get rolling into some of those FSMA Friday updates and hear all about the hazard analysis precautions that you're going to walk us through. But please, if you could, just spend a couple of more minutes telling us a little bit more about your background and what you're doing over at TAG.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the introduction. As Jim said, my name is Sam Davidson. I'm a Director of Food Safety with the Acheson Group. I am based in Toronto, Canada. I have 30 years, unbelievably, over 30 years experience in food safety and quality. Time flies. I'm initially from Ireland, but now, as I said, I'm in Canada, working with the Acheson Group. And what do I say about the Acheson Group? We are a global food safety and public health consulting group. A lot of the stuff that I get involved in is generally in the US, and a lot of FDA FSMA work. Like a few of us in TAG, I'm trained as a lead instructor for the human food safety rule under FSMA. I'm also a lead instructor for HACCP Alliance. So I do a lot of work in between the codes and with the codes, and I see a lot of amalgamation between these codes. So yeah, we spend a lot of time doing that. I definitely work on some 483s, some cars from CFIA, assessments for facilities. We help with training. TAG itself has a food safety culture assessment tool. We're going to talk about that maybe a little bit later on. But there are a lot of areas that we're involved in, and it's primarily I'm food safety, and basically anything to do with food safety.
That's awesome. All right, Sam. Well, I know there's a ton of FSMA updates to get to on the next slide. Let's dive right in.
Awesome, thank you. So we have here our list as we have every year or every month, and I've added a few more because I'm in Canada. I've added a few other bits and pieces that you would maybe not normally see under FSMA. But I guess the first thing is October the 1st is looming. We have to actually be mindful of the potential government shutdown. If the new fiscal year for 2024 is not passed, we may have issues within our within the FDA, within inspectors, within regulations. So just be mindful of that. It could be something that happens in the next few days. So keep an eye out for that and be mindful of what could be happening. I did talk about TAG and public health, and one of the things that I want to talk about, I'm not sure if everyone knows or how many people know about it, but there has been an outbreak in Canada, in Alberta, in daycares, E. coli 0157H7. At the last count, I believe there were 355 cases, all to do with daycares. I want to say maybe 20 or so were adults, the rest, so over 300 cases were for children. There are some in hospitals suffering from HUS. Something to be aware of. The outbreak, as far as they are aware, it is meatloaf and vegan loaf that was being supplied from a central kitchen to these daycares. So it's just a reminder that these outbreaks and serious outbreaks still occur, and this is a pretty big one. It's still ongoing, and it's heartbreaking when we hear about, you think about daycares. So just something to keep in mind. The FDA has finalized draft guidance for sprout operations, and it's now available on their website as a revised draft guidance. CFIA continue to declare avian flu zones, avian influenza zones across Canada. It has obviously gone down, but there has been at least a couple this week that I have seen coming through. The FDA has updated the food traceability question section with info on inspections and product tracing. Also, around that, there have been technical amendments to the food traceability final rule, and again, they're all available on the website. They have been up probably just for the last couple of days. So, hazard analysis. Some of this stuff I want to talk about. I would say a lot of people that work with food safety plans, food safety systems, will have a good understanding of hazard analysis. But how can we strengthen? Like, what is it that we need to do? How can we improve these things? And how does that affect our food safety culture? How do we make our food safety culture stronger using hazard analysis? FDA talks about it on their website. You know, there is a download on hazard analysis and food safety plans and how to conduct a hazard analysis. And what they're really talking about around their hazard analysis is identifying potential hazards, which could be ingredient related, process related, and hazards that may be introduced from the environment. So these are areas that we need to look at. What I got here is, anyone that knows this will probably look and scratch their head and say, what's this guy talking about? This is rubbish. Taenia saginata is not a physical hazard, and it does not appear in leafy greens. We know that it is a worm, right? So, and it does not appear in leafy greens. It appears in beef from Africa and some parts of South America. So the reason why I had this is a little bit of an analogy that I once went to audit a HACCP plan. I was a HACCP auditor in a former life. And this was in Canada, in Toronto. And this was one of the things that they said they were worried about Taenia saginata. The importance on this is coming up in these next few slides, is identify the hazards that warrant control. What is the likelihood of that appearing in leafy greens? It's impossible. It doesn't exist in leafy greens. So we need to ensure that we are identifying the correct hazards and the controls involved with that. And in some cases, this has become somewhat of a emergent issue, I would say. We are seeing more that FDA are digging deeper into food safety plans and their hazard analysis. Are you identifying the right hazards? Do they warrant control? What about this likelihood and severity? Do they need to be in your food safety plan? So, as I said, FDA will come in. One of the first things they'll come into your facility, and this happens in CFIA, and we see the various other entities on the screen. Hazard analysis, they promote their hazard analysis. You will see that there's the Appendix 1 hazard analysis from FDA. It's available online. CFIA hazard database is also available online. There's a lot of information there. So what do we do with all these hazards? What do we do with all this information from our regulatory authorities? You know, just because a hazard is listed on a regulatory database, is it reasonably likely to occur at your facility? So this is going back and looking at, you know, the identification, the understanding of your hazards. You know, just because a regulatory authority says it's in their database, does not necessarily mean that it's going to happen in your facility. For example, a brand new facility would not necessarily have the same risks associated with one that's older and needs a bit more care and love and attention. Sometimes you will have work with older facilities that were not really designed in the way we would like to see new facilities designed today. You know, something like airflow. You know, we've worked in, I'm sure a lot of us have seen these older facilities where airflow is a problem. New facilities will not have that same problem because they're designed that way as food safety top of mind. So here's another question then. When we talk about this hazard analysis and we talk about the regulatory authority will come in and say, have you looked at our hazard database? Have you reviewed it? Have you looked at, have you performed the hazard analysis using Appendix 1 by FDA? And you will say yes, hopefully. But the next thing is then, how do you document if it has been determined not likely to occur in order to comply with regulatory agencies? So what if you look at this and say, well, you know what, these hazards don't exist in our facility, or we don't believe they're likely to occur or warrant any type of control measures. So how do you document that? What is it you need to document? How do you document that to satisfy regulatory authorities? And this is going to go on, there's going to be a sort of a theme going on today with the rest of this. You know, it's around documenting. So one of the important things when you're performing a hazard analysis, when you're reviewing these things, that you have your team. You have your food safety team meetings. You review whatever it is you need to do on your food safety plan, whether it's a preventive control plan or a hazard plan, and you will look at these hazards, and then you will document in your meetings. You'll have your scribe there in your team meetings, and you will say, yes, we reviewed these hazards, and these hazards are not associated with our location. We believe, and you have that justification, and you put that in your plan, or put that in your meeting notes, and then when it's asked, you can have that available and say, here you are. Here are the reasons why we feel we do not need to warrant, or it's not warranted as a hazard in our facility. So there's a lot of information there. You have to bear in mind too as well that if you are importing or exporting, you will need to look at the hazard database or the hazard analysis of the country that you are importing or exporting to. So for example, if you know, Canada and America are huge trading partners, US are huge trading partners. So if you are importing or exporting into Canada, you will need to look at the Canadian database. Of course, there's equivalency there, but in some cases, there are some hazards that would not be in the FDA one, and vice versa. If anyone from Canada here and they're exporting into the US, they will need to look at FDA or USDA regulations to ensure they are meeting the requirements. So there's a lot of information out there. This is the things we have to deal with. When you're looking at your hazard analysis, when you're looking at what you're performing, there's a lot of complexity to it. What we have here, and this is thank you to the National Center for Food Protection and Defense for letting us use these slides. I'm sure probably quite a lot of you have seen these slides before. It's the complexity of our hazard analysis, the complexity of our global supply chain. You look at the humble cheeseburger here that we have, the Great American Cheeseburger, and look at the ingredients that we have involved with this, okay? So, you know, it doesn't look too bad, you know, the ingredients you have here. Then we break it down a little bit more. There's the ingredients for your buns. There's the ingredients for your cheese. There's pickles. There's all these different ingredients that we have to consider then if we were to do a hazard analysis just on a cheeseburger. The humble cheeseburger, as I said, it's not so humble when you look at the ingredients that are involved here. So we need to consider all these ingredients when we're performing our hazard analysis. What is the risk? What's the complexity of it? You know, what's the severity of these if there is an issue? But not only do we have to understand the ingredients, we don't have to look at where these ingredients come from. Does it matter that we get vinegar from Argentina? Does it matter that we get tomatoes from Poland? These are the things we have to consider when we're performing our hazard analysis on our ingredients. We need to understand the location or the source of these from our suppliers. We need to understand, is there something in these countries that may be an issue or may not? We may have concerns around, say, for example, excessive pesticide usage in some countries where there may be a higher risk of pests. In some cases, there may be a higher usage, or maybe even pesticides that are not approved by the EPA for use in the US or North America. So this is just the start of what we're doing for this hazard analysis for the cheeseburger. It becomes very difficult and time consuming. And these are issues that we have when we're performing a hazard analysis. If you look at all the things that we need to look at, and we haven't even gone into the process, and we're not even going into the processes here around the cheeseburger. These are just the ingredients we're talking about. There's a lot of information. There's an analogy I've heard and used a number of times. Some people haven't always heard it, which shocks me. But how do you eat an elephant? You know, the answer is one bite at a time. You need to be looking at these, and you need to be taking small bites of this, because this is a lot of work and it's overwhelming. When we are performing the hazard analysis, and this is what we're seeing now, and this is the focus on FDA, is about the generalization. Often there's too much generalization on the types of hazards and their manifestation. When we talk about manifestation, we're talking about how it gets there, or what happened, presence, contamination, survival, growth of bacterial hazards. Generally, biological hazards we're talking about. Too many times we see pathogen contamination of whatever the ingredient may be. That's all it says. Too many times we see pathogen contamination during a process, but we don't know what type it is. And it makes a difference. We need to know what's the difference between one pathogen and the next, or do we have different control measures? If going back up to our tapeworm, and we look at that, do we have a different control measure for that? If we include that in our hazard analysis, how do we control it? We don't need to, because someone's gone over and beyond. So we're now trying to justify how we control a hazard that really does not exist in our process and not in our ingredients. So we need to be specific, organism specific for sure. We need to identify these and say, okay, this is how we control this one thing. This is how we control another organism or pathogen. And it's okay to have numerous lines for an ingredient or for a processing step for biological hazards. Don't lump them all in together and say you're going to cook it and that's going to eliminate them. We have concerns around toxin producers. We know that toxins do not get eliminated by cooking. Yeah. We have other areas that it's easier to eliminate or control. You consider staph aureus. A lot of that is going to be down to training and employees and hand washing, good hand washing practices, good GMP practices. So there's different areas that we can control, and especially post-cook. Great example when we have Listeria monocytogenes. That's an environmental one that we have to be worried about after cook. So we can't always lump every pathogen into one section and say, this is how we eliminate it, or this is how we control it. Well, as I said before, we need to know how the hazard got there. Cross contact for allergens, is it survival because of incorrect cooking? Maybe time and temperature for storage enables growth of something, even the presence of it. We want to ensure, or we like to hope that it's not there, but if it is present, then how do we control it? So there's all these different ways, and maybe it's the contamination from, we talk about the manifestation, but how it got there, including how it's surviving or how it's there. So it could be, as I said, cross contact for allergens between non-allergen and allergenic ingredients or finished products. We could talk about growth, as I said, because of time and temperature in a warehouse. Okay. We also need to sort of get the understanding of the location. Is there a process there that may enable the proliferation of these hazards? Is it because do we have the risk of chemical contamination because of poor sanitation practices that left sanitation chemicals on the equipment? So we need to describe in as much detail as we can about how the hazards got there, so then we can control or eliminate it. So for example, if it's, as I said, the chemicals, the residual chemicals on equipment, then we know that there's maybe a training issue, or it's there's a problem with our SSOPs. Okay, the sanitarians, the people performing sanitation, maybe have not been trained properly on the SSOP, or the SSOP is incorrect. So then if we see these, then we know how to correct them. Instead of something generic that ends up leaving us with a lot of open space or a lot of open-ended areas that we now have to work harder on to complete. When it's specific, it's easier to complete. It's easier at the start to have it open and say very generic or very general, but when we have to try and control them, then it becomes a lot harder. So when we're specific about it, it's easier to control. So that little bit of extra work at the beginning helps us at the end. Then when we look at, there tends to be, and it always was, that QA or food safety wrote the plans. Hopefully it's not that same way now, and there's definitely progress towards food safety teams and impacts and the information in there. But it was at the time, QA will write the food safety plan. And in that case, what we were finding was, or what we still find is, that there was a lot of focus on pathogens, but not so much on chemical and physical hazards. Okay? As QA people, and I speak for myself as well, because all my experience is FSQA, we like to think we know everything. We don't. And again, that's going back to our food safety team and going back to documentation. We will have the expertise throughout the team that will help identify physical hazards and chemical hazards that the FSQA people do not generally see. I have another analogy at a company I used to work with. And the maintenance manager and the plant manager, this is an Acheson plan, they decided to walk the process flow and identify all the steps and identify all the potential hazards and sort of services that were included in there, processing aids, that sort of thing. They were able to identify areas within equipment the QA team had never been able to, because they didn't understand the equipment as well as maintenance did. They knew what the equipment was there for, but they didn't know the risks and challenges involved with that equipment. So we see a lot less detail in chemical and physical, because historically, as I said, QA, FSQA are the ones that initially wrote these plans. So we got to look back on these, especially these areas that have had less attention to detail, and we need to ensure that we have the correct team members involved with these. And this is what we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Hazard analysis. It is essential that both the scope and nature of the hazard and the source clearly defined. So just what I talked about before, we need to ensure that the food safety team can clearly define what the hazard is, the source and/or cause of it, and then we can determine from that the appropriate control measures. Very important that we understand hazards and the team understand hazards, and employees and operators understand hazards and what they're doing to ensure that they know the risk. If they are, for example, a PCP or a CCP monitor, what happens if there's a deviation? What happens? We know in FSMA, we talk about corrective actions and listing the corrective actions that would normally happen when there's a deviation. But there are times when there may be a corrective action or deviation that that's unique or we haven't come across before, and then we divert to our basic corrective actions. But we need to ensure that everyone involved in this understands the hazards, understands the deviations, corrective actions, and the implications if things don't go correctly. How does your food safety team perform a risk assessment? We've got all this information here. This graphics in the background is great, showing us all the sort of information we have. Once a hazard has been identified, is the assessment detailed enough to identify the control measure? So again, we go back to, as I mentioned, if it's a certain area, like I said, sanitation or maybe allergens or maybe survival of something. If we're specific enough, then we can identify the correct control measure. We don't have to list a whole huge area or huge lists of each step that we must look at or each program we must look at. If we're specific enough, we don't have to do as much. And again, it helps us in the end if we identify these and have enough detail in there. So then you know, how can control measures be correctly identified without all the information? Can they really? I guess you can put blanket statements. You can list all these different programs that can help for it. But is that really helping us? Again, we have to then, if we are in deviation or if we look at some sort of failures, then we need to go through all these programs and all these SOPs and everything that we have listed in our hazard analysis. We got to go through all of them, and this all has to get documented. So again, we are creating more work for ourselves by identifying too many programs or areas for controlling a generic hazard. Said, and I'm going to emphasize this, it has to be specific, so then it makes it more controllable. Okay. When we have these generic hazards, I'm going into HACCP a little bit here and decision trees, but you know, in the end of the day, it's all food safety programs, so that's the important part that we have to consider here when we're talking between FSMA and HACCP. But if you're not specific enough, how can you use a decision tree? Right? How do you have the correct information to go through a CCP decision tree to understand the control measure that you need to have? You end up going around in circles. And I've seen it lots of times when people aren't specific enough that people can't come out to a conclusion. All of a sudden, they'll have some random step in their process that needs to become a CCP. Because that information is not there, and because we haven't identified the hazard correctly and been specific. Now, talking about our risks, you know, we talk about severity versus likelihood. And we need to understand, you know, the tools. How do we do this? How do we perform them? And one of the things, and I hate that I have to use this as an example. You know, we look at worst case scenario. Okay, we use information about the product description, the intended use, and its distribution. And I have to use this example of the daycares in Canada right now. You know, when they look at the likelihood versus severity, right? Maybe they were thinking, okay, well, our likelihood's pretty low, but what about the severity? You know, and we've now seen this. We look at worst case scenario, and we look at what's happening now. It's high severity. Even though when it's low likelihood, when we consider, we have to consider something like E. coli 157H7. It should always be high. Simple as that. And this obviously has been a case where it's a perfect example of worst case scenario. Your intended consumer. Okay, who's your target consumer? I use an analogy or an abbreviation. I call it YOPI, young, old, pregnant, immunocompromised. That's the YOPI group. They're the ones that suffer the most. When we look at what we're producing, who the intended target or consumer is, we need to consider those YOPIs. Specific for different, if it's general consumption, maybe we don't have to be as concerned, although general consumption still will include YOPIs. But if it's specifically targeted to a specific group, like the daycares, the central kitchen that was making for the daycares, we have to consider something these with a higher severity, higher impact. Does this risk assessment affect the hazard analysis? Well, how? Well, we look at it, we need to understand, using again the daycare as an example, we need to look at these susceptible areas in our population, and we need to realize that, you know, this is a big deal. This is bigger than we see the evidence. There are children in right now on dialysis because they've had HUS, because the severity is so high. So that then brings us round to how do we get this in, and how do we strengthen our food safety culture around this? Well, there's lots of terms, there's lots of ideas around food safety culture. GFSI has pushed this so much, and probably this is one of the reasons why we have a good turnout today as well for this, that food safety culture has become important. It's been the buzzword or word phrase for the last few years. How do we quantify it? How do we ensure that we are improving our food safety culture? How do we gain that understanding and commitment from not only our team, but our facility, our employees. What is it that we need to do? Here's an example of food safety culture assessment that TAG uses. You will see that there are two categories in here that take up over 50% of the assessment. Okay? Number one is people. It's number two on the list, but the highest impact is people, and the second highest impact is hazard and risk awareness. Okay? So what does that tell us? Really, what we want to have is people that understand the hazard and risk awareness. Okay, people that are trained, people that understand what's going on. But how do we do that? We can't just sit and preach to people in a training room. You know, sometimes it doesn't sink in. Everyone has a different way of learning. So what is it we need to do? How do we ensure that the risk awareness is introduced to people that have the biggest impact on food safety? You know, we see it a lot that too often the people that have the most impact on food safety, like the boots on the floor, I guess, they don't fully understand or comprehend the hazards and the risk. What happens if a cook fails? Does it matter to them if the temperatures go off or alarms go off? Well, you know, maybe they're told to stop the line because there's an alarm going off. But what does that really mean to them? I guess in some cases when you have maybe foreign material detection equipment, you know, metal detector or X-ray, that's something more physical. It's something they can understand and see. But if a cook fails, what does that mean to them? Do they really understand the importance, the risk involved with undercooked product going out? So why do we do that? What do we get involved in? What's our evidence? This is our big thing, right? Quantifiable. How do we quantify that food safety culture is living and breathing in our facility? Okay. Well, we're going to have leadership to start off with, because without leadership, where's our guidance? How are we going to do one thing? How are we going to do something else? It's very difficult. We need to have that understanding from the top down. And a lot of times we will see in our food safety culture assessments that leadership gets it. And that's great. But does it get all the way through the entire organization? Not necessarily. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing too many times that the employee involvement isn't there. Well, why is that? Is it because of lack of training? Is it because of lack of technology? Lack of procedures? There's definitely a few areas that we have considered and looked at this. And this is where I go into this first principle of HACCP. This is from Codex. First principle of HACCP is food safety team. You know, what's so important about the food safety team that help us with our food safety culture? Well, they're the ones that help identify the hazards. They're the ones that work away on the hazards and what they should be, what we're looking at, what we're identifying, and they will help us with our control measures. Once we identify the correct control measures for those specific hazards, we've gone to do all that work and looked at these specific hazards to make sure that we have the right control measure, right programs in place to control it. Then we can help train and we can help people understand. Okay? Food safety team is there. They're committed to it. They have that information, as I said, with this management commitment. So the food safety team needs to have that time. Okay, they need to have that statement from the management team to say that we will provide support. And with that comes the time, people, equipment, and training. This all costs money. You know, we are in the business of making food. Management will go, well, that's a lot of money to do that. We're in the business of making food and making money, but at the same time, if we're not making safe food, we're not going to make anything and we'll shut down. So we need to ensure that that corporate policy gets through from that management commitment part, as I said in the previous slide, that the management are there for. Then how else do we do this? Great way of doing it is through food safety team meetings. Meeting minutes, I discussed it earlier when we looked at hazards or eliminating a specific hazard, it's recorded or it's documented in meeting minutes. We've looked at it. This is the reason why we don't do it. Anytime we have a food safety team meeting, there should be a scribe there to help record things. And recording that information will be evidence to show a regulator, or an auditor saying, look, this is what we've done. This is the information we've discussed around our hazards. This is showing food safety culture. As long as the team members are engaged, is what we have to remember. When we have discussion in the meeting between more than just the QA or food safety personnel, we want to have our cross-functional team as our food safety team on site. We need to ensure that these meeting minutes include all those people have discussed it. We want that discussion. We want to have interaction with our peers in this food safety team meeting. And that goes along well with our plan. When we're looking at our hazard analysis, we want to have input from other people. As I said before, your biological hazards tend to be stronger. There's definitely a lot more information. Again, maybe sometimes too generic, but there's a lack of detail in chemical and physical hazards, which is where you require people outside of FSQA to help. So we talk about cross-functional teams. We talk about these people that should be on the team. And I understand that there's, and I'm sure we all know and we get that it needs to be different departments. We need to have maintenance, sanitation, operations, definitely more, maybe R&D. The list could be endless. But does that mean it should be the head of that department, the lead of that department? Are they necessarily the correct ones? Sure, they can help. They can understand certain things. They can help with policies and procedures. But what about that information getting down onto the floor? We talked about employee engagement. How do we get employee engagement from this food safety team meeting to the floor? Should it be the manager or lead of that department that works in this team meeting? Are they always the ones that have that information from the floor that we can put into our hazard analysis or we can discuss as potential hazards? We hear a lot on webinars, on discussions around, the key people involved with food safety culture and how that information gets transferred within a facility. Lone Jesperson's a great one for it, and she's done a lot of work with FDA, and she's helped present it. And I have seen on numerous occasions, numerous webinars, the key to that information sharing is our supervisors, people that have that link between management and employees. We need to be bringing in the supervisors and documenting that in our meeting minutes, in our food safety team meetings, when we're reviewing our hazard analysis. We need to document that these people are coming into these team meetings and they are participating and they are sharing information. When they share the information from the floor into the food safety team meeting, then there's more information that we can help identifying the hazards and controlling those hazards. And then vice versa. Once we have buckled down our hazard analysis and really got to understand what the issues are, then that information flows the other way again through the supervisor, with training, with on-sites, with continuous assessment and constantly on the floor, talking to employees. That information then flows both ways. So then that helps. And we document. I always say in trainings, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. Anyone that might have been on any of the trainings that I've gone through, I try to hammer that home all the time. We need to show, to be able to quantify our food safety culture, the involvement with our team and how that reflects on the floor. And then how do we prove that once it's on the floor? Well, we perform our on-site observations or our on-site verifications, and we talk to the employees and we ask them what they do or what they know about their task, especially if they're a PCP or CCP monitor. Say, okay, what are you doing? Tell us what you're doing. Tell us why you're doing it. And then ask them what happens if there's something's not right. You get the wrong result. You get a warning light, you get a flash, the line stops. What do you do then? What are the consequences if you don't act when there's a deviation? What's the impact to consumers? So these are all ways that that will help quantify that food safety culture part when it comes to hazard analysis. We have that back and forth, and it's really important that we understand where this information is coming from, how we get it, where that flow comes through. Again, that download that you can get on FDA around conducting a food safety hazard analysis, there's lots of information out there, and this team should be reviewing this information. They should be reviewing the FDA hazard analysis, the CFIA hazard database, and we talked about that and all this information you can get. But there's more information out there as well that this team should be looking at or getting through. There's definitely a lot of information on the internet. Do not use TikTok, do not use Facebook or whatever those other ones are. We need to look at something that is peer-reviewed publication, and maybe use Google Scholar for searches on certain things. There's definitely information out there as long as it's reputable. So that's definitely a big area that we need to look at. Again, there may be hazards that you have that hazard database does not have, or that occurs maybe in your facility that the hazard database do not show, or maybe you were able to get some information, extra information or extra areas that maybe the hazard analysis or databases do not have. So put them in, use them, show that you are looking more at just what FDA expects of you. Push it. Look for more areas. Interview your employees. Have your supervisors work close with your employees and be present on team meetings. And document. I don't think I can say document enough. Document, document, document. So
I'll say too, document.
Thank you, Jim. So that's really where I've been pushing from, and that's really where we're seeing a lot of push now from auditors and regulators around being specific on your hazard analysis and how that hazard analysis can improve on your food safety culture.
Awesome.
With that, I will pass it over to Jim. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam. This is truly jam-packed with a lot of, at least I took away a lot of notes on this, because this, as you say, with the many different layers around what is a hazard and how do you know if it's going to impact what you're doing, and how might it have an impact once it leaves your facility. So many different considerations. The complexity is vast. So I kind of want to start over there, just because you did call out the fact that, yes, even though there's many hazards that are listed by the multiple different regulations out there, and not all of them are going to apply to your facility, how do you know that you're actually able to track all of these things? Does TAG offer maybe some type of solution around monitoring that every single hazard that you've identified as potential risk is being tracked, and you have a handle on emerging hazards or maybe changes in the regulation that might call out a new hazard to what it is that you're doing?
That's a great question, and there's definitely, TAG do issue weekly, monthly posts, and it's really good. There's a lot of very good information there that if you sign up for, you will get them in your email, and they're quite regular on exactly that: emerging food safety hazards or emerging issues that you'll find, and that's for both public health and food safety. But then there's other things as well that you will expect to have, that again comes from your team. In-plant experience as well as scientific knowledge is great for your impact on that. Not everything comes out of books, right? We have the experience with the employees, with our food safety team, and the idea, and especially around GFSI standards, they look at who's in your team and why are they in that team, and that you will find a lot of time this experience is one of the main reasons why they're on that food safety team. So, looking at equipment practices, the raw material, sanitary practices, these are things that come from experience and knowledge of your team and your team members. That's why it's important that you have that right selection. You select the right people for that team.
I definitely agree with that. Now, you had kind of called on the cheeseburger, that whole process, which is great, and mentioned that, there's obviously more strict laws in some areas and more lax laws in other areas when it comes to food safety. And, you're one person, maybe you have a team, but how can you possibly know all of the regional laws of the areas that you're getting raw ingredients from and how that might impact your food safety risk?
That's another great one, and that's, I will probably default to the foreign supplier verification program, because in North America, as I said, we do have our equivalencies between Canada and the US, and the manufacturer of any of these ingredients, if they're in the US or in North America, then they will comply with the regulations that we need for safe food. If you are receiving something from another country, then you will need to rely on the foreign supplier verification program. And those foreign suppliers will have to comply with FDA regulations on that. So they will need to prove that they have got the right food safety plan or PCP. They won't necessarily call it FSMA there, but they'll call it maybe a HARPC or something like that, with a hazard analysis, risk-based preventive controls. It will be expected that they have something like that in place before they can even ship to the US, North America. So foreign supplier verification program, and it's a big one. And we're getting a lot of work around that. We're getting a lot of work around helping international suppliers comply with FSVP.
Right, that makes sense. I want to switch over to another point you made around processes where, there's a million processes going on at the same time. And you had brought up the example that there could be some, for example, cross contact with an allergen. And you have to kind of do that analysis around what are the risks? How deep can we go to identify the risks? And can we adjust our processes to avoid those risks? And again, a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, and it sometimes takes the act of the risk to appear for you to kind of dig in and do that analysis. But do you have any advice around steps that folks can take in order to proactively identify maybe unseen risks, such as that cross contact with an allergen?
Yeah, that's a great point, because we're not clairvoyants. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict everything that's going to happen. But it's that awareness, I guess. It's that food safety awareness, that training, that understanding, and that comes back to our food safety culture. Being proactive is part of our food safety culture. If we go back into that model I showed you earlier on, where we get to a certain point where we are working, or we are a mature company, or our food safety programs are mature, that becomes proactive. That becomes something that people have become aware of. We would maybe look at incidents like trending, definitely trending with GFSI, and really push trending. But what does that mean? Like, what are the things that can impact our food safety culture from training our food safety? We can look at things like audit reports. We can look at consumer complaints. We spend more time on the plant floor. The problem is with a lot of these audits and a lot of what we have to do, there's a lot of time that we're desk jockeys. We can't get out onto the facility floor enough. And that's where we rely on, or hopefully rely on, the employees, and getting back to that link with the supervisors, right?
Right.
Have that interaction, or have that hopefully that relationship between employees and supervisors where they're willing to share that information.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about that because you had brought up training, and when it comes to food safety culture, I would think one of the biggest risks to a successful food safety culture is the fact that, as you called out, everybody learns differently, and there is no one size fits all to make sure that everybody gets it. Now, I did hear you kind of say, all right, well, you could do kind of on the spot training, something to that effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
But would you say there are factors, say you have high turnover, or maybe there's just it's not a priority because you have to meet your production goals, or there's just limitations on the time you should be spending on training. I guess what advice do you have for folks to make sure that that training is successful, and how do you measure that it's successful?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing, I'll answer your last question first. Um, if it's successful, then you will see a downturn in deviations. You will see a downturn in held product. Your numbers will get better. There will be increased efficiency. You'll have greater runs, so the lines are not getting stopped. So once the information or the learning is there, you will see an improvement on your metrics. How do you do it? Employee turnover. Jim, if I had that answer, I could
Haha.
retire quite easily. Um,
Okay.
but what we try to do is we would use tenure or time at work, or employees that are trusted and we know have been there for a long period of time or longer. We would put them in those positions that we would deem maybe higher risk or greater importance, because we know not that there's anything wrong with a new employee coming in, but we know those employees there, and we have that level of understanding of that person and maybe their personality. In some cases, maybe you don't want that at all because you know them too well and you don't want them near these things. But in general, you will rely on people with that tenureship that you would put into these positions that can then help train others on the job while you're doing it.
Like a mentorship rather than
Exactly.
maybe fall on some type of like technology or something like
Yeah,
that. But yeah, make sure that those that do understand, who lived through it, can coach the new hires.
exactly. Yeah.
Yep. I got one here from Lorna. This is a pretty interesting one. She actually wants to thank you for the pragmatic advice. She says, we are now living in a world of testing to zero, identifying
Mm.
hazards, but not necessarily risks. Do you have any advice for those of us challenged by test results from clients for items that we don't think warrant CCP controls?
um, you cannot test your way out of a problem. Let's start with that.
Hmm.
Thank you for the comments and thank you for the question. Um, that's difficult. When we are manufacturing, especially if it's not our own brand, or if we're private label, and a customer requires that you perform that test, that it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to get away with it. Even though you can say, well, we have performed our hazard analysis, we have done everything we need to do, and we do not determine this to be high risk or risk enough that warrants a CCP. You will find some cases that customers will be adamant that it has to be a CCP. So it's difficult to get out of it. I guess the way you do it is through results. I know I just said you can't test your way out of things, but you can test your way out of that requirement for your customer. If you're able to show them a series of results and say, look, we're getting nothing here, and then request maybe the back off the frequency, the amount of tests, because testing is expensive. We have seen
Right.
since, sending stuff out for a lab is expensive. So we need to try, I guess, try to prove it to your customer. And I have seen it. I have seen it where different large scale companies have accepted enough information. If you can supply that to them, that verification that your food safety system works, that you've got no issues, you've got no negatives or high counts or anything that's in deviation, you can, provide audit information, audit results, internal and third party. Say, look, these are, this is evidence. And even you'll find a lot of these larger suppliers will have their own audit team that will come and look at things. So you
Hmm.
can sort of bounce things off them and say, listen, we can prove this. What's the need?
Hmm.
And you can back off maybe a frequency or sometimes altogether eliminate it. I was with a spice manufacturer a few years ago, back when metal detection was mandated as a CCP by CFIA. But this facility was able to prove they could catch farm material before even the metal detector.
Hmm.
So CFIA were then say, okay, you do not need to have metal detection as a CCP. So that investigation, almost like almost like performing a validation on something, where you're able to prove this, and it needs to be a scientific. It's like a project. This isn't a one-page assessment. This is a project over time using mathematical modeling or using Six Sigma or something like that that you can then prove with a certain confidence that you do not believe this to be a risk.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. And as Lorna writes, yes, thanks for the reply. Proof in the pudding through testing results to reflect no or low risk. And she does agree that testing is indeed getting expensive. All right, I got another here from one of our attendees. This is a biggie. You called it out, leadership, right? Management.
Yep.
As FSQA, my facility's operational leadership is extremely resistant to engaging in food safety activities, whether it's creating opportunities for employees to receive ongoing training, presence in food safety decision-making and implementation, and elevating the food safety culture in our facility. Please, do you have any advice?
Make them accountable for it.
Mm,
Have food safety as part of their growth, as part of their metrics, not just production.
right,
I guess that's easier said than done, right? Because you'll find, as I said, we are in the business of making food, right? We
sure.
cannot make food if we're not profitable. But I found that in other companies that do a lot of scorecarding, a lot of metrics, a lot of matrices, operations personnel have health and safety and food safety as part of their growth programs.
Mm-hmm.
And once they start doing that, there will initially be a big push because they will say, no, it's not a food safety issue. But once you get into that system and they understand what happens when there's an impact to them in their growth or on their KPIs, then they'll soon see that the importance of food safety. And that has to be driven from the top. And we're talking not just your operational leaders, but I'm talking above that. I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about, that has to come from almost like your CEO or your owner. Again, it's not easy. If you're in a smaller operation, you probably find that the CEO is so involved in operations that they are saying, push, 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 we need to improve now,
Right.
or improve our production numbers. But at the same time, if you're having issues, if you're having deviations, that will show up eventually in audit reports. That will show up in your food safety culture reports. When you have GFSI mandating these things, your score starts to go down. That's when interest gets peaked on, well, why are our scores going down? What's happening? Why are we not maintaining or getting what we need or getting better? Because you don't
Yeah.
have that culture in there to promote training.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have that culture there to help improve upon things. Now, I understand that the whole point about time and stuff like that on the floor, on the spot training can help.
Right.
Again, technology can help that way, but at the same point, are people willing to invest in those sort of systems to help with that as well? It is a struggle.
Yeah, and Sam, you called it out where you said everyone, and it is going well beyond just the plant floor. It needs to understand these hazards and what happens if there's a deviation and what's the impact if the corrective action fails. There's there's a ton of impact, right?
Yeah.
And obviously those at the top of an organization or in charge of an organization, when they hear things like operation uh, stops or there's a monetary impact and also reputation, right? We all know
Mm-hmm.
that happens. To the case of what you were saying is happening currently with the daycare centers. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. Nobody wants to deal with that. It's
Yeah.
it impacts so many people. So getting those at the top in leadership positions to really understand it, going really to the core, like how would you feel if this happened to your child who's in daycare, right? Making it very real for them.
And that's one of the things I had implemented in one of my previous roles was bringing it back home. Um, you know, how would you be willing to feed your family the food that you're making?
Right.
Put up posters around, even not necessarily the food that you're making, but during holidays. So at Christmas, maybe you'll how to cook a turkey properly. In the summer, how do you barbecue properly? Put up just even like comic type things or humorous type posters up there. That there's
Uh-huh.
plenty available online that you can put up
Right.
on a notice board and say, this month's food safety topic is, you know, barbecue season. How do you barbecue? how do you ensure you're not imposing or you're not creating a risk for your family?
Yep, I agree. There's definitely a ton of resources. I know TAG has a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Sam, unfortunately, we are just out of time. We've reached the top of the hour here. So I want to thank you again. This was an outstanding presentation. I do hope you come back soon. For those of you, I appreciate you coming on and hearing FSMA Friday this month. There's more resources that you can tap into. Please do check out the Acheson Group at achesongroup.com or Safety Chain at safetychain.com, where you can find resources there all about food safety culture or how to put metrics around food safety, etc. Please do check it out. And if you have any other questions, please send them in. We are always available and ready to answer them. So from all of us here at the Acheson Group and as Safety Chain, thank you. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend ahead.
Thank you. Goodbye.